was 1858, and deep in the wooded hills of North Carolina, a small log cabin stood half hidden among the trees. Its roof sagged under the weight of time, smoke curling thinly from the chimney, but to anyone passing on the dirt road below, it seemed no different from dozens of other homesteads scattered through the Appalachian foothills. Families built such cabins everywhere in those years, carving lives from the soil, surviving winter after winter, with little more than their hands and their will. Yet this cabin was not like the others, for here lived a family that, according to neighbors, travelers, and even local officials, never seemed to leave. At first glance, this was not remarkable. Rural life in the mid-19th century was hard, and many families rarely ventured far from their land. But over time, whispers began to grow. The family within the cabin, whose name would flicker in church records, in tax rolls, and in faded letters, were said to be seen only at dusk, if at all. Children in nearby farms spoke of dim figures moving behind windows when the moon was bright, of a woman's silhouette rocking endlessly in a chair, of voices too faint to make out drifting from the cabin long after midnight. Travelers reported that the cabin never welcomed visitors. Its door was always shut, its curtains always drawn, and yet smoke always rose from its chimney. Livestock never grazed nearby. No one saw fields being tilled or wood being chopped, yet the cabin stood inhabited year after year. The family did not trade at the market in town, nor did they attend church, though their names still appeared on rolls. They did not send children to school, nor did they answer when neighbors called. It was as if the family had folded themselves inward, retreating entirely from the rhythms of communal life. Those who claimed to have encountered them described an unsettling stillness. A farmer once swore he saw the father standing by the doorway at dawn, his face pale and blank, his eyes following the farmer without a word until he vanished back inside. Another woman, lost on a hunting trail, told of knocking at the cabin only to be greeted with silence, though she could hear faint breathing and shuffling within. These stories spread quietly, for in rural communities gossip could be dangerous, and suspicion often lingered beneath polite silence. Still, the cabin became an object of fascination and of fear. The mystery deepened when officials came to collect dues. They found the cabin locked, the shutters sealed tight. No one answered their knocks. Yet when they returned weeks later, smoke still curled from the chimney. A log had been added to the woodpile, though no one had been seen cutting trees. It was as if the family existed entirely within the wooden walls, their lives concealed from the world. In time, the cabin became a marker of dread. Children were warned not to stray near it, lest they catch the stillness said to haunt the family inside. Stories drifted into local lore, that the family had made a pact to never leave their land, that sickness had bound them to the home, that they were cursed, or worse, that they were no longer alive in any ordinary sense. The cabin, though ordinary in timber and stone, grew heavy with suggestion, its silence louder than any cry. To approach the cabin was to feel a kind of weight pressing on the chest, neighbors said. As if the air itself thickened in its shadow, hunters avoided its woods. Travelers hurried past, eyes averted. Even in broad daylight, the place seemed cloaked in dusk. By the winter of 1858, the whispers hardened into something stranger. A young boy swore he saw faces pressed to the window glass, more faces than the family should have had. An old hunter told of hearing a woman laugh from inside, though he had been told the mother was long dead. Farmers muttered that sometimes the smoke rising from the chimney smelled not of oak or pine, but of something acrid, like burnt cloth or even bone. The cabin was lived in, yes, but by whom or by what remained an open question. And so, the story of the family that never left their cabin took root. It was not merely their isolation that unnerved neighbors, but the way the cabin seemed to resist the natural order of life in the hills. While others aged, married, died, and were buried, the family within the cabin remained unchanged, silent, hidden, yet undeniably present. The cabin was a wound in the landscape, one that no season seemed able to heal. As we begin to unearth their story, we must tread carefully, for what survives is not a single clear account, but fragments, a line in a ledger, a name in a parish book, a rumor told in hushed tones by descendants who refuse to go near the place even now. And as we move further into the shadows of 1858 North Carolina, the question remains, what does it mean for a family to never leave? Did they choose their seclusion, or did something darker choose it for them? To understand the unsettling story of the family that never left their cabin in 1858, we must first step back into the wider world that surrounded them. Mid-19th century America was a nation stretched between the old and the new, a country of contradictions, prosperity and poverty, faith and superstition, expansion and isolation. North Carolina, perched between the coastal plains and the rugged Appalachian foothills, reflected these tensions in its landscape and in the lives of its people. The 1850s were years of transformation and unease. Railroads had begun to stitch distant towns together, carrying goods and news faster than ever before. Yet in much of North Carolina's western and rural regions, life moved at the pace of the horse, the plow, and the seasons. Families carved homesteads in thick forests, building cabins from the very trees they felled, their survival dependent on hunting, farming, and barter. Roads were little more than muddy tracks, easily swallowed by rain, leaving whole communities cut off for weeks at a time. In such conditions, seclusion was not unusual. A cabin deep in the woods could feel a world away from its nearest neighbor, and winter could make isolation unavoidable. But there was a difference between being isolated by circumstance and retreating into seclusion by choice. Most families, even in the harshest conditions, clung to communal ties. Sunday gatherings at church, markets in small towns, the exchange of labor and tools among neighbors. These networks ensured survival. To live apart from them was to court suspicion, for the community was not only social, but essential. The culture of the Appalachians in this era was steeped in a blend of tradition, folklore, and practicality. Faith played a central role. Church records often doubled as the only written documentation of a family's existence. Superstitions lingered, drawn from Scots, Irish, African, and native traditions that mingled in the hills. Stories of curses, spirits, and warnings from the dead were carried on the lips of farmers and hunters, repeated beside fires on long nights. In such a setting, a family who walled themselves off from the outside world could quickly become the subject of speculation, their silence interpreted through the lens of fear and belief. The larger social climate of the 1850s also casts a long shadow over the story. America was on the edge of rupture. The Civil War loomed less than 3 years away. Tensions over slavery, states' rights, and political power shaped even the smallest towns. Many families in rural North Carolina lived under the strain of uncertainty, unsure which way loyalties would fracture when war came. Distrust simmered beneath the surface, and communities were quick to mark anyone who seemed other or unwilling to conform. Economically, the region struggled. Wealth concentrated in the hands of large landowners and planters in the east, while the western foothills remained rugged and poor. Families in cabins survived through subsistence farming, producing just enough to live. Cash was rare. Barter was common. Tools and clothing were handed down until they disintegrated. Hunger was never far away, and sickness could spread unchecked in small, remote homesteads. Against this backdrop, the idea of a family withdrawing fully into their cabin becomes both more understandable and more unsettling. On the one hand, poverty, illness, or shame might drive them to hide from neighbors. On the other, such secrecy in a culture that prized mutual aid could only deepen suspicion. A family absent from markets, absent from pews, absent from harvest gatherings would not simply be forgotten. They would become the focus of unease. There were also medical realities at play. The 1850s were a time when epidemics swept through towns with terrifying speed. Cholera, typhoid, yellow fever. Families struck by sickness often quarantined themselves, whether by choice or by decree, their cabins turning into prisons of necessity. To neighbors, such absence could easily take on a darker cast, especially if the family never returned to the rhythms of community once the sickness passed, or if none were seen again. The land itself added to the mystery. North Carolina's forests were vast and heavy with shadow, its ridges and valleys isolating one community from the next. Travelers often wrote of how the woods seemed endless, their silence broken only by the crack of a branch or the call of a bird. It was a landscape that invited both survival and fear, a place where one could disappear, sometimes by choice, sometimes by force. A cabin tucked deep into those trees could feel like another world, sealed off from the passage of time. Cultural historians note that tales of families withdrawing from society often emerge in periods of upheaval. They become symbols, warnings of what happens when people turn inward and away from the communal bonds that held rural life together. In the Appalachians, where folklore often carried moral lessons, the cabin that never opened its doors could easily transform from fact into myth, and from myth into a cautionary tale retold for generations. Yet the story of the family in 1858 was more than rumor. Their names did exist on rolls, their land noted in county records. That a family truly lived there is beyond dispute. What remains unclear is why they chose, or were forced to retreat so completely. Were they hiding illness, debt, shame, or did their silence grow from something stranger, a pact or belief rooted in the superstitions of the age? What is certain is that their isolation marked them. In a time when community meant survival, they stood apart, and in that separation they became more than neighbors. They became a story. It began with silence. In the spring of 1858, the forest around the small settlement in North Carolina carried an unease that few could name. At first, it was nothing unusual. The family in the cabin, the Whitfields, had always kept to themselves. They were not unfriendly, merely private, content to live apart from the bustle of the growing town. But when Sunday after Sunday passed without their arrival at the wooden church, when no one saw them at the market or on the narrow road that wound toward town, people began to whisper. The first real unease was spoken by Mrs. Eliza Carr, who lived nearest the trail that led to the Whitfield homestead. She told her neighbors that she had not seen smoke from their chimney in weeks. The Whitfields were known for their wood stove, which smoked heavily even in spring as they boiled water or roasted meat. Without it, the cabin stood cold, a silent mark against the greening woods. At night, she said, the clearing where their home sat looked too dark, as if the cabin swallowed the moonlight rather than reflecting it. Her words planted seeds of fear. A local preacher suggested perhaps illness had struck, for outbreaks were common in those years. Yellow fever, dysentery, even strange fungal fevers that spread through moldy bread or damp cellars. The thought that the family might be stricken down together was not far-fetched. Yet others muttered about shame, that perhaps debt or sin had driven them into hiding. Still others, lowering their voices, wondered if something unnatural had happened. Weeks turned to months, and then came the summer heat. Fields bloomed, children played barefoot, yet the Whitfield cabin remained silent. Finally, a group of men agreed to walk the trail and check. It was mid-July, the air thick with insects when they set out. The forest grew heavier the closer they came to the cabin. Birds stopped calling, and the men noticed the way the air cooled, though no clouds hid the sun. As they pushed through undergrowth, one of them, a farmer named Hale, said he felt as though they were trespassing on something sacred or cursed. When the cabin appeared, it was like stumbling upon a grave. Logs dark with weather stood crooked, moss clung to the roof, and weeds had grown tall around the steps. No prints marked the path, as though no feet had touched it for months. The door, shut tight, bore a coating of dust and pollen. They knocked. The sound echoed hollow, carrying strangely in the clearing. No answer came. A second knock. Silence. Finally, a man pressed his ear to the door and claimed he heard something faint inside. A soft creak, like a chair shifting, or perhaps only the wood settling. One of them circled to the back and found a window cracked with age. When he peered inside, he recoiled so sharply he struck his head on the frame. The others rushed to look, and one by one, they saw what lay within. The family sat at the table. It was not the chaos of sudden violence. They had not collapsed on the floor, nor scattered in panic. They were seated upright around the wooden table as if still in the middle of supper. The father, John Whitfield, had his hand resting on the table's edge, frozen mid-gesture. The mother, her bonnet still in place, leaned slightly toward the children. A daughter of perhaps 10 rested against her mother's side, her eyes closed, though there was no breath left in her body. The plates before them had long since dried to crust, the remnants of bread and meat stiff and blackened. At the center of the table sat a jug. Its contents were gone, but the dark ring left inside suggested it had once held wine or cider. Flies clung to its rim, and the sour odor reached even those peering from outside. The men were torn between terror and duty. They forced the door open, the hinges shrieking, and the stench of decay rolled out. The air was thick, oppressive, carrying not just the odor of rot, but something chemical, acrid, that stung the back of the throat. Inside, the silence was worse than the forest outside. Dust floated in shafts of dim light, and the figures at the table seemed to be watching, though their eyes were empty. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned chairs, no clawed marks on the floor. Only stillness. It was as if, at some quiet moment in the spring, the family had sat together, lifted their cups, and chosen not to rise again. The bodies were removed and laid out in the small church. Examination in those years was crude. Doctors had only their senses, not laboratories. Some believed the darkened lips and stiffened jaws suggested poisoning. Perhaps the wine had spoiled, or perhaps someone had laced it with something deadly. Yet the family's faces, though waxen, bore no signs of agony. They looked instead composed, almost peaceful. The jug became the object of speculation. Some swore it had been filled with cheap wine from a traveling merchant, spoiled with mold or toxins. Others muttered of deliberate choice, that the Whitfields had agreed to a quiet pact, tired of the world, sealing themselves away in silence. But this explanation never satisfied. Neighbors remembered the children, full of life, and asked, what parents would lead their little ones into such a fate? Stranger still were the stories that followed. After the bodies were taken, no one wished to claim the cabin. For a time it stood abandoned, nailed shut. But hunters returning from the woods spoke of faint lamplight flickering in its window, though no one lived there. A traveler claimed he heard laughter, thin, childlike, drifting from the clearing at dusk. Then came the incident of the Carter boy. Barely 12, curious and reckless, he sneaked to the cabin despite warnings. When he returned, he was pale, shaking, unable to speak for hours. Later, he muttered that he had seen the family still at the table, just as they had been, except they turned their heads when he entered. The boy never set foot near those woods again. Newspapers wrote cautiously, reporting only that a family had died in mysterious circumstances, but in taverns and kitchens the story grew darker. Some said the land itself was cursed, that the soil carried poison, that springs ran tainted with minerals. Others whispered of folk practices, old rites whispered in secret, that might bind a family to their home beyond death. Doctors argued quietly, suggesting ergot poisoning, a fungus in rye bread that could twist the mind and blacken the body. Perhaps, they speculated, the family ate the same bread, drank the same spoiled wine, and succumbed together. Yet this theory did not explain the stillness, the calm arrangement of their bodies, the absence of frantic collapse. The cabin lingered in memory. Seasons passed, timbers sagged, but the story remained alive. Men who dared to pass the trail at dusk claimed their lanterns dimmed inexplicably. A woman swore she heard the faint sound of chairs sliding across the floor inside. Dogs whined, refusing to set paw near the clearing. The Whitfields became both warning and legend. Preachers used their tale to speak against isolation, claiming that to cut oneself from community was to open a door to darkness. Others told it as a ghost story, a reminder that not all deaths are explained, that sometimes families sit together in silence and do not rise again, and always. The question lingered. Was it sickness, accident, or something else that had bound them there in 1858? The silence offered no answer. The discovery of the Whitfields spread through the settlement with the speed of wildfire. Within hours of the bodies being removed from the cabin, townsfolk gathered in clusters outside the church, whispering in tones too hushed to be casual. The spectacle of an entire family seated in death was more than tragedy. It was a mystery, and mysteries festered quickly in a community already steeped in superstition and fear. The first to confront the scene formally were the doctors. Two men, Dr. Horace Allen, who had served the county for nearly 2 decades, and a younger physician, Dr. James Rowe, recently arrived from Raleigh, examined the bodies under lantern light. Their methods were crude, for this was 1858, when medical science stood at the cusp of discovery, yet lacked the tools of certainty. They noted the discoloration of lips and fingernails, the slackness of limbs, the strange calm of their expressions. Poison, Allen declared with cautious gravity, seemed the most likely explanation. Rowe disagreed. He suspected an illness of the blood, perhaps brought by tainted grain or stagnant water. Neither could prove his claim. Pastors stepped forward next, their voices carrying the weight of Scripture. Reverend Samuel Dyer preached that very Sunday on the dangers of withdrawing from the flock. He told his congregation that the Whitfields' silence, their long absence from church, had been the first sign of the devil's shadow. A family that closes its doors to the community closes its doors to the Lord, he thundered. The congregation sat stiff in their pews, some nodding, others glancing away. Few truly believed the Whitfields' evil, but the preacher's words lodged themselves in memory. Neighbors, meanwhile, remembered smaller things. Mrs. Carr confessed that she had heard faint knocking from the cabin on a night in June, though she told no one at the time for fear of mockery. A farmer claimed he had seen John Whitfield only weeks before, carrying wood with a strange look in his eyes, though no one else recalled such a sighting. These contradictions only deepened the unease. The newspapers wrote cautiously, careful not to incite panic. The Carolina Watchman devoted a column to the tragedy, noting only that the family passed from this world under unusual circumstances. Yet between the lines, speculation bloomed. Letters to the editor hinted at contagion, warning travelers to avoid the region. Other papers further afield embroidered the tale, claiming the family had been found kneeling in prayer, or that the jug at their table bore the mark of skull and crossbones. Children whispered at night, daring one another to creep near the forest's edge. Some claimed to have seen figures moving between the trees, though none dared test their courage too far. Parents used the story as a warning. Stay close to home, avoid strangers, pray diligently, lest your family too fall under a silent curse. The more practical-minded argued over land and legacy. With no heirs beyond the children who had died, who would claim the Whitfield homestead? Few wanted it. Farmers shook their heads, muttering that the soil was blighted. What crop could grow, one asked, in ground where a family chose death? And so the cabin remained unclaimed, sinking deeper into ruin. The psychological impact on the settlement was harder to measure. For months afterward, townsfolk reported a heaviness in the air, as though grief itself hung over the roads. Some grew fearful of gathering for supper, leaving jugs unfinished at the table. A few even shunned wine altogether, convinced that whatever had lingered in the Whitfield jug might spread like contagion to others. Scientists of the time offered their own detached interpretations. A traveling lecturer on natural philosophy, visiting from Charleston, told a fascinated audience that such deaths might be explained by ergot poisoning, a fungus that infected rye bread, producing convulsions, hallucinations, and death. His explanation satisfied some, but others countered that no one recalled the Whitfields raising rye that year. Besides, ergot victims rarely died quietly seated together. The debate spilled into letters, sermons, and gossip until the Whitfields' story became less about the family themselves and more about the anxieties of the living. For doctors, it was a case study in the limits of their knowledge. For preachers, it was proof of divine justice. For neighbors, it was a tale to warn their children. For the wider county, it was a story to embellish, darken, and pass along like a ghost lantern in the night. What united them all, however, was the sense of unfinished business. The family had not died in fire or in storm or by the hand of an enemy. They had died in silence by their own table with no witness to explain it. That absence of explanation left a wound, one that each part of the community tried to cover with their own truths. But the wound remained, festering in the collective memory, growing stranger with each retelling. And so, the cabin stood, avoided yet never forgotten, a scar on the edge of the settlement. Travelers passing through heard the story and carried it onward, reshaping it in taverns and stagecoaches until the Whitfields became not just a family but a legend. Yet in North Carolina, where the moss crept over their abandoned home, the memory was sharper, heavier, less myth than fact. For those who had lived through it, the Whitfields' silent meal was not folklore. It was history. The Whitfield mystery should have ended the day their bodies were carried from the cabin. In most tales, death closes the story, yet here it only deepened it. What remained was not silence, but tension, as if the family's departure left behind something unbroken, waiting to unfold. It began with the burial. The townsfolk gathered in the small churchyard, a crowd thick with both reverence and fear. Coffins were lowered into the ground, but few dared stand too close. Some swore they smelled the sour tang of spoiled wine drifting even there, carried on the breeze from nowhere. As the last coffin was set into earth, the ropes trembling in calloused hands, a sound rang out from the trees, a low creak like timber straining. All heads turned. The woods stood still, yet unease rippled through the crowd. For weeks after, the settlement seemed to unravel. Horses balked when led near the road toward the cabin. Lanterns sputtered out without reason. A farmer's wife walking home at dusk claimed she saw a girl in a faded dress standing at the edge of the path, silent, unmoving, with eyes that reflected no light. When she looked back a moment later, the figure was gone. The sheriff organized another party to examine the cabin, hoping to quiet the rumors. This time, a dozen men went, armed with lanterns, rifles, and the uneasy bravado of those who would rather not have gone at all. They forced open the door again, though it had been nailed shut after the removal of the bodies. Dust thickened the air, motes swirling in their lamplight. The table still stood, plates hardened to stone, the jug black with residue. Chairs creaked as if touched by unseen hands. One man swore he heard a sigh from the corner, soft as a child drifting to sleep. Another swore the floor was cold as ice beneath his boots, though summer heat pressed heavy outside. They lasted only minutes before stumbling back out, faces pale, muttering that whatever lingered inside did not want them there. The town divided between those who believed in supernatural forces and those who insisted on natural explanations. Yet even the rationalists could not ignore what happened next. In late August, a thunderstorm rolled over the county. Lightning split the sky and the woods shook under the weight of rain. By morning, the cabin's roof had collapsed inward, the structure leaning like a wounded thing. Some hoped this destruction would bury the legend along with the timbers. But when curious eyes peered into the ruin days later, they claimed the table still stood untouched, its chairs upright, its jug unmoved. Whispers spread of voices carried on the storm. A woman who lived miles away told of hearing faint singing during the tempest, a hymn she recognized as one the Whitfields had sung in church years earlier. The thought of their voices echoing through the storm chilled even the skeptics. The climax of fear arrived in September, when 2 hunters failed to return from the forest. A search party found them near the clearing, rifles dropped, expressions locked in terror. They lived, but when roused, neither man could speak of what he had seen. They shook, eyes wide, and avoided the trail forever afterward. One later muttered in a fevered whisper that he had seen the family rise from their chairs, moving with stiff grace, as if joints creaked like wood. "They looked at us," he said, "and they knew we were not meant to be there." From then on, no one approached the cabin without dread. Some even claimed that, on autumn nights when the wind was sharp, they heard the faint sound of chairs scraping against wood, of cups lifted in a toast. The jug remained in the cabin, untouched, a silent centerpiece to the fear. The community's fear reached its climax when the preacher himself, Reverend Dyer, announced he would confront the cabin. He declared it a test of faith, a battle between light and shadow. Armed only with scripture and a lantern, he entered the clearing one October evening, followed at a distance by dozens of townsfolk. They watched as he opened the door and stepped inside. The minutes stretched unbearably. Then came a shout, harsh and strangled. The lantern light flickered wildly through the cracks, then went out. Silence. The crowd surged forward, panic rising. When they pulled the door open, they found the Reverend kneeling on the floor, trembling, clutching his Bible as though it were the only thing holding him upright. His hair had gone white at the temples, and his voice, when he finally spoke, cracked with terror. "They are still there," he whispered. "Not their bodies, but something of them. They wait at the table, and they do not want to leave." The sight of their spiritual leader broken left the community shaken. Fear had reached its peak. No one argued anymore. Whether sickness, curse, or specter, the Whitfields had left behind a presence that clung tighter than life itself. The cabin was declared forbidden ground. No farmer would claim the land. No hunter would cross it. No child dared test it again. The climax of the story was not an explosion of violence, but a surrender. The people ceded that part of the woods, allowing the cabin to stand alone, collapsing slowly into earth, yet never entirely gone. It was as if the family had bound not only themselves, but the land itself into their silence, leaving behind a warning no one could quite decipher. By winter, the settlement had learned to live with the fear. They whispered, they avoided, but they no longer tried to solve. The Whitfields had won a place beyond explanation, their final meal stretching endlessly across time. In the darkest hours of night, when the wind shifted, people claimed to smell the sour sting of wine again, faint but unmistakable. and always they turned away, unwilling to follow the scent to its source. Years passed, and yet the Whitfields story did not fade. The cabin itself decayed slowly, its timbers bowing to rot, its roof collapsing beneath storms. By the 1870s, it was more ruin than home, but still people swore that the table remained upright, the jug in place, as if protected from the decay that claimed everything else. Farmers avoided the clearing, their plows tracing wide arcs around that stretch of land. Children grew into adults, carrying with them the memory of warnings whispered by parents. Never follow the trail to the Whitfields. The family had become a cautionary tale, a local myth rooted in soil and silence. Yet beneath the folklore lingered questions that never found answers. Some held to the belief that it had been poison, a jug of spoiled wine shared in ignorance or despair. Others insisted on disease, pointing to outbreaks that had swept through rural communities before. And still others believed it had been choice, that the Whitfields, isolated and weary, had decided to leave the world together. Their final act, one of unity rather than tragedy. But what unsettled the community most was not the cause, but the aftermath. Why did so many continue to feel their presence? Why did animals shy from the clearing? And why did travelers describe the same sensations decades apart? The chill in the air, the oppressive silence, the sense of being watched. Was it the echo of grief imprinted on the land, as some early philosophers of psychical research suggested? Or was it a trick of memory, the way stories carve grooves into our minds until we see what we expect to see? By the turn of the 20th century, the tale had been retold so often that it no longer belonged solely to North Carolina. Folklorists cataloged it as a story of death at the table, comparing it to European tales of families struck down by plague or legends of households cursed for pride. Some framed it as a moral fable about the dangers of isolation, others as proof that spirits linger where grief is unresolved. The Whitfields were no longer just people. They had become symbols, yet even symbols leave traces. In the early 1900s, surveyors marking land for timber reported strange compass failures near the site. Hunters camping nearby told of dreams so vivid they woke screaming, visions of a family seated in silence, lifting cups in slow, deliberate toasts. One man swore he woke with the taste of sour wine on his tongue, though he had drunk only water before bed. For modern eyes, explanations seem simple. Ergot fungus, carbon monoxide from a faulty stove, psychological contagion in an isolated community. Science offers many doors through which we can walk. And yet, when standing in the clearing where the Whitfields once lived, the science seems insufficient. The silence presses in, the air feels weighted, and the imagination supplies what the history books cannot. What remains is not certainty, but mystery. Did the Whitfields truly die together by their own choice? Were they victims of chance, poison in a jug, illness in a loaf of bread? Or did something less tangible settle into their cabin, an invisible hand that led them into silence? The cabin itself is gone now, its remains swallowed by forest. But the story lingers. Those who live nearby still tell of strange quiet in that patch of woods, a place where birds refuse to sing and the wind itself seems to falter. They say the family never left their table, that in some unseen way, they are still there, waiting, watching, bound forever to the meal they never finished. And so the Whitfields endure, caught between history and legend, fact and fear. Their silence is a reminder of how much in our past remains unexplained, how much we fill with shadow when the light of reason fails. Perhaps the truth will never be known. Perhaps the truth is less important than the unease their story awakens in us. That sudden chill when we imagine a family, together at their table, lifting their cups and choosing not to rise again. The family that never left their cabin remains not just a tale of death, but a mirror reflecting our own fears of isolation, of silence, of endings we cannot understand. And until we stop asking what happened in those woods in 1858, their story is not truly over. It lingers like the faint scent of spoiled wine on the night air, impossible to trace, impossible to forget.